Hi, I'm Becky Johnson and this is Linda Lamaster.
Thank you.
I'm Robert Norris. Hi. And what should we talk about today? They want us to run this, but I want to be run. I want to be manipulated. I wish to be...
Talk about your experience with the police. Talk about what you think of the police. Talk about what you've experienced in Santa Cruz as activists and what role did the police play when it comes to activism and social movements. Talk about John Dine. Anything you'd like. You have a wealth of experience between the three of you.
You know, it could be argued whether we even need the police at all. Can't we just police each other with polite behavior most of the time, and every once in a while you got to call the guy with the shotgun? But that's kind of how it was done throughout most of history, how we policed each other. Well, I've come to believe that we really do need a police force, if nothing else, to allow us to not have guns in our homes and weapons that could harm, say, people that are suicidal, family members that are suicidal. I don't want to have guns in my home if my kid's going to shoot himself in his room, you know. So I say 911 is my gun, but sometimes when you call 911, the cops come out and shoot your loved one. And it's not a black and white answer that we have as a society about what to do with having a police force, but having that police force follow the rule of law as we intend them to. And increasingly we're finding that society is just sort of releasing the police to, one way or another, take care of social problems as those who have money and power see them. And increasingly that's protesters and homeless people. And I guess that's where the three of us have really kind of come in the crosshairs of late with our own interactions with police in our own community, lately through the Occupy movement and our involvement in that. And I know the three of us were very much involved with that encampment that was set up in San Lorenzo Park, where a lot of homeless people that we knew were refugees from Peace Camp 2010 the year before. They were the same people were setting up tents and setting up communities there, and we were very supportive of that.
Yeah. I felt like a midwife in relation to the Occupy movement, which was thriving, but majority of young people right then, in terms of the camp, because it was a real conflict. And I can conceive that it could have just really ripped Occupy apart or shrunk it sooner, because the camp sort of like triggered or exposed all of our antipathies about homelessness and the homeless, which should be a bad word. And it had to express itself in Occupy as a group. In order for people to even begin to communicate, they had to share their prejudice or preconceptions, I'd rather say. And so it was important not to let whoever had the most people share in their point of view at a given General Assembly to silence the other people, you know. And it wasn't always the same dominant half either. So that was a really important dialogue, and there were a couple times I think that made a difference in moving from a few tents to 50 tents to 100 to 150 before the police decided that we weren't allowed to be there.
Well, we had porta potties for 225, so that's the number I'm going by.
Yeah, well, I mean, I counted 150 before they came. I don't know how many. I counted tents. I didn't count
about
heads.
180 were actual homeless people who found refuge there. And since that encampment's been dispersed, they're still out there. They're just on the levee and behind dumpsters and.
There's been a recent crackdown on homeless people in Santa Cruz, although it's a periodic and frequent and regular deal. But you know, when a merchant was stabbed by a guy who had used the services of the homeless, what I call the homeless lack of services center, because it doesn't provide real shelter and it's more of a jail-like environment for those who go there. The council, which has always been bad, the Santa Cruz City Council, had some even worse people on it, and we're talking about more restrictive measures to scapegoat and blame homeless people. And police have then, particularly under the impetus of the Occupy movement nationally, which is raised a countervailing power, because it's shown that the mass power of people, you can see this particularly in Oakland and New York and other large cities, and still, in spite of the fact that a lot of the occupies have been broken up and the encampments are few and far between, they're coming together. I think even on the date of this filming, tomorrow there's a big protest plan for against Führer Obama, who's coming to Oakland. And in Santa Cruz, this I think enabled the police to start using tactics that I haven't seen really for, I don't know if I've ever seen the tactics they use. I mean, you know, occasionally you get trigger happy cops who shoot down people like Happy John Dine, but the whole police force doesn't really do that as a matter of course. What it did in the Occupy movement was first they completely deported, evacuated, and tore down survival campground for 150 to 200 people. Then those of us who protested, kind of a weak, small protest, went to City Hall. They bivouacked at City Hall, thinking we were going to take over the City Hall, locked down all the offices, refused to allow us to go into Parks and Rec, and the chief of police himself threatened to arrest me or cite me if I walked across the street, to witness 5 or 6 of his officers surrounding a photographer and grilling him because he was over there taking pictures of this very military formation of police. This was back in December of 2011.
They had the whole block circled with them.
Yeah, I mean, and they also, of course, most recently went after the so-called Santa Cruz 11, of which Becky and I are 2, which are simply people who are either reporters or journalists or supporters, but not really organizers generally, of a movement to take over a bank, which has been done in other places. In fact, much more vigorously sometimes. Banks have been occupied and business has been disrupted. This was a vacant bank. It was 3.5 years vacant. And it was held for 3.5 days by people who wanted to create a community center. And I went in there and I did some reporting on that, did some interviewing, and no one was arrested. Police sort of stood around. At one point, the police did try to go into the bank, and they were held off by a mass of people with arms linked. And the police had brought along, you know,
Not enough.
near lethal weapons. They had brought along a squad of tear gas and pepper spray people. We learned about this in court later. But they didn't use them. Instead, they wisely backed off. Because this was a block from downtown. It would have resulted in something that James here may be familiar with, who's watching this filming, the 1994 New Year's Eve riot. That is to say, when people were attacked by the police at the town clock at midnight on New Year's Eve, and their attempt to leave was blocked. They streamed downtown and started breaking windows. This would have been, I would say, like 2 or 3 times that, because there were so many angry people. So the police wisely backed off, and they kept saying they wanted to negotiate with people. I understand.
And there were no windows broken, so.
Nothing was broken. I mean, there was some vandalism done to the building in terms of graffiti, and some furniture was broken later.
Supposedly.
But I'm saying when the police arrived at this bank and the people had occupied this empty building, they didn't see them setting fires and breaking windows or anything. They were just in there putting up posters.
Oh, they barricaded the doors to make sure that the police didn't go in. But the point was that everyone left the bank peacefully after 3 days, probably because they were afraid the police were not going to be so peaceful. But the police, continued to make lots of threats, but didn't do anything. And then 2 months later, they came and arrested people at their homes who were not really particularly centrally involved in this. Some of us who were reporters, Becky and I was a reporter. Becky wasn't even in the bank, she says. Are you telling the truth? And
I was too chilled to go in the building.
And I've been charged with misdemeanors before, and in many infractions, jaywalking and sleeping, which is an infraction in Santa Cruz, or was until recently. But I've never been charged with felonies, and I was charged with 2 felonies: conspiracy to vandalize and conspiracy to trespass, which, all in all, if you add all the charges, is a 7-year jail term or prison term if you're convicted and they choose to give you the maximum sentence. So we're currently, I guess we're March, April, May, June, July. 5 months into this trial process, and they're still prosecuting 7 of us, even though the judge has repeatedly thrown out these charges. The district attorney insists on bringing them back, and it's a little unclear. Maybe it's an election year, maybe it's the police department was upset because the police department really suffered a humiliation. They were essentially held off by the people. And that was the real lesson of the Occupy movement. The people can, at least initially, hold off the police. And that is something, of course, that authority can't really tolerate or is very afraid of. It actually isn't such a bad thing. It's probably a very good thing that these, not even if the police were the best people in the world, you need countervailing forces in society. And, you know, this wasn't a violent holding off. This was an angry holding off, but it was an attempt to assert. Well, first of all, you have Wells Fargo, which is a predatory lender that's been given, I don't know how many billions by the federal government to continue the same practices it's always done, which is seize people's homes, destroy people's families, and make a nice profit while sending all the money overseas. And it's
also the #1 investor in the for-profit prison industry.
It's also the one of the top 3 most often sued by regulators for their exploited practices, like having the highest overdraft rate compared to the other banks. You know, they usually come for Wells Fargo, and then B of A follows a few months later when they're finally getting around to regulate these many other services the banks are pulling out of thin air to charge us for.
And of course, it's Wells Fargo that is filing the complaints against us. But it really is the police department, I think, that it was humiliated by the fact that we, not so much us personally, as the people in the bank, and the people outside the bank who refused to allow the police to pass, were able to say, here's a countervailing power, and that's something that upset them. So what I originally was thinking, you were talking about police violence. This is what you wanted Jim to focus on, and you've been interviewing other people around this. I hear a lot more about police violence than I see. For example, I did a radio show, I do it twice a week, and I get phone calls and I do interviews, and I hear a lot about police for unnecessarily harassing. There's a lot of that. Getting tickets for things that are not particularly criminal. That essentially mean get out of here. We don't